So as my way of saying a massive thank you to everyone who has supported The Glass Blind Spot in 2019, I thought I'd round the year off by looking back at some of the work I've been involved in over the past 12 months. And as well as offering regular subscribers a little bit of behind the scenes insight about what's going on in my head when I'm making this content, I'm going to talk a little about my plans for 2020, including some mildly significant news concerning the future of The Glass Blind Spot. So I guess I should start with the challenge formerly known as the Kate Smurthwaite Challenge. And again, a massive thank you for everyone who supported it and more generally has supported this channel over the year. And in particular, I want to say a great big thank you to Karen Strong for helping me to get over that particular hump. And I'm pleased to announce that I met up with Karen for a chat recently, which I shall be sharing with you all soon. In my humble subjective opinion, I have to agree with those of you who keep telling me that this channel is criminally undersubscribed. But that being as it may, a huge landmark for me this year was the day that I was finally able to hold my head up with pride and say that by the dual metrics of subscriber count and average views, I am better than Kate Smurthwaite. Much better. And frankly, when you combine that with all the positive comments and encouragement I get from those of you who watch this channel on a regular basis, to be honest, it's more than enough to keep me going. That being said, obviously, I am keen to keep growing my audience, and although right now it feels like a very far away and distant, possibly non-existent possibility, my dream would be to get to a point where I could actually afford to dedicate myself to making content for you all full time. In fairness, that's probably a pipe dream, especially given the way that YouTube are throttling channels like this, which is something I want to say a bit more about. But for now, let me just say that as long as there is a small number of you who value this content, then it is very much my honour to make it for you. I do it all in my spare time, and as I'll talk about later, it can involve a not inconsiderable amount of expense, so I guess I should take this opportunity to remind you that if you fancy supporting this channel and also get a little something special in return, you can buy me a coffee or subscribe to me on Subscribestar. And of course, having reached a point where I could say that I was much better than Kate Smurthwaite, there are two people I have to thank for helping this channel to reach the lofty landmark of being in or around the point of being better than Caitlin Moran. So let's start with the one that I actually like. I'm going to talk about my coverage of the Carl Benjamin Jess Phillips kerfuffle in a bit more detail. But first, I want to take this opportunity to thank Carl for the support that he's shown this channel over the year, and not least for agreeing to sit down with me for a chat during ICMI 19. And I should also give Rail Raven a big thank you for managing to do something with my dodgy audio. Here's a top tip to any aspiring YouTubers. If you're ever recording an interview with someone, my advice is don't sit down and do it directly beside a crowded bar. Anywho, a small number of subscribers have been critical of content that has featured Carl, and while personally I suspect that they are somewhat suffering from Sargon derangement syndrome, I thought I'd take this opportunity to say a few things about that. In the interest of full disclosure, I am a regular viewer of Carl's channel, and I'm a great admirer of his work generally. That all being said, while my coverage of all things Sargon could undoubtedly be perceived as to some extent supportive of him and his positions, I want to stress three things. Number one, which should really go without saying, but just because you like, support, or even just talk to or about someone, clearly it doesn't automatically follow that you support or agree with absolutely everything they've ever said or done. Number two, while I do genuinely like Sargon personally, I have always done my utmost to ensure that my coverage of stories involving him has been as objective and neutral as possible when it comes to the matter of documenting facts. I've also repeatedly acknowledged that plenty of people view his comments about Jess Phillips to be both offensive and abusive, and the main reason I've been particularly interested in documenting the ongoing fallout from them is to hold a mirror up to the deeply disingenuous and frankly abusive and offensive way that the mainstream media has repeatedly covered it. And number three, while I'm not going to deny that either the name Carl Benjamin or Jess Phillips feature in the title of 4 of my 5 most watched videos this year, with 2 exceptions, hopefully you'll all agree that when I've made videos about them, it's because I've actually got something meaningful and significant to say. Which brings me to one of those 2 main exceptions. Obviously, the main reason I've continued to follow the Jess Phillips not rape threat story is because, incredibly, after 5 years, that story still hasn't gone away. And if anything, it got even bigger in 2019 after the Dirty Smear merchants used it as a stick to beat Carl Benjamin with when he put his head above the parapet and stood in the European elections. And while I'm sure by now some of you are sick of me banging on about it, there's no denying that my videos on this subject have introduced more people to the glass blind spot than any other. So much so, in fact, that 2 of my most viewed videos in 2019 were 2 years old and on that subject. And incredibly, the 3rd most viewed video of this year was this little throwaway effort, which took me about 10 minutes to throw together while watching something on TV. And they say that blokes can't multitask. And so I've picked it to talk about because that fact helps to highlight a dilemma that I have when it comes to making content for this channel. Hopefully you'll appreciate the amount of time and effort that goes into making some of my content. And I have to admit that I do occasionally wonder if it's all at all worthwhile. Most of the time I think it totally is, because as long as someone gets something out of something, then it totally is. But it's hard not to get disheartened sometimes, especially now that YouTube have definitely started messing around with the algorithms and have put channels like the Glass Blind Spot on the naughty step. Depressingly, until a recent bump that came from another shout out from Sargon, my subscriber count had sat suspiciously stubbornly at the same number for about 4 months, apart from occasionally when it would immediately drop by 10 as soon as I published a new video. And the most depressing thing about producing content under these conditions is not just the feeling that this platform is actively working against me, but also the reality that someday soon I could very well wake up to find all my efforts entirely deleted and with absolutely nothing that I can do about it. So with that possibility in mind, I've decided to take a few precautions. And by the way, if you haven't registered for updates from my websites, then I would really encourage you to do that, because either that or Subscribestar may very well be the best way to keep in touch if YouTube do suddenly decide to pull the plug. To be honest, on principle, I'm tempted to just entirely decamp to somewhere that's actually happy to have me. But in the short term, it occurs to me that on a platform whose days seem numbered for independent content providers, the most sensible thing to do is actually start a second channel. Partly as an insurance policy, partly an experiment into algorithms. But having decided that that's exactly what I'm going to do, I figured I might as well have a little fun. And so if you check back tomorrow, you can find out all about it. And most importantly, why I think you should bother to subscribe. For now, all I'll say is that the Better Than Neckbeards video will give you a little clue regarding what you can expect to find on it, because the main rule I've set for myself is that it doesn't take up very much time away from producing content for the Glass Blind Spots, which I very much hope to be doing for many years to come. Okay, I also want to say a few things specifically about Jess Phillips, but first let's switch things up a bit and talk about some other highlights of the year. So number 4 is the video that honestly nearly broke me, but happily also happens to be the one of which I'm probably most proud. It's also easily the one that by some country distance had the biggest budget, involving amongst other things 2 transatlantic flights and a new laptop, because believe it or not, I basically had to edit it from scratch 2.5 times. Thanks to one frazzled motherboard, a dodgy external hard drive, and my tardy approach to backing things up. But enough about my woes, because at the end of the day, it was a labour of love, and I hope that it captured at least a small essence of which was a quite extraordinary 3 days of talks on men's issues in Chicago, curated by the always brilliant Honey Badgers. ICMI also provided me with the brilliant opportunity to get talking to fascinating people like Paul Elam, Janice Fiamango and Mike Buchanan, and hopefully you didn't notice this too much from the front of house, but the content I was able to generate from that event also helped me to keep pumping out reasonably regular videos while I've been dealing with a few things behind the curtain. I won't bore you with the details, but it's been a tough year personally for both myself and for Mrs. Blindspot. And while it's required me to take the foot off the pedal a couple of times recently, having this channel to work on has also been a great comfort, as has the sense that it might in some small way offer others a bit of something, including hopefully the occasional smile. Anyway, happily I can report that we're getting back to full strength. So let's talk about one of the things you can expect to see more of next year. Sadly, but behind the scenes distractions meant that I was only able to finish 2 episodes of Problems with Men this year. So one of my main priorities for 2020 will be completing the episodes I had hoped to get done in 2019. And I was really pleased that the last episode achieved the most views for that series to date, because I think it's really important to hold a mirror up to and debunk the whole alt-right white nationalist tag that progressives are trying to project onto MRAs. To be honest, January is going to be a pretty busy month for me, and I'm probably going to have slightly less time to make videos in general next year, so Problems with Men will probably start dropping in February. But one of the most important things I've learnt since making content is that it's better to put out quality content that I'm happy with when it's ready than setting myself arbitrary deadlines simply to rush towards. And of course, another problem with setting deadlines is that sometimes I just have to drop everything to quickly point a finger at something else. Which brings me to video number 6. One of the reasons I tend not to set myself arbitrary deadlines for projects is that I often find that a project takes twice as long to finish than I intentionally hoped. And another is that I like to come in behind the initial headlines in an effort to document and examine the main story through reactions and hindsight. But every now and again a story or issue pops up that I feel needs to go out as quickly as possible, and the story of J4MB's eventful trip to Cambridge is exactly one of those. Although sadly all too predictable at the time, looking back it is still quite remarkable to think about the jaw-dropping levels of double standards and below-the-belt behaviour displayed by privileged feminists teaching or learning at the very apex of British academia. Probably the only thing more predictable was the acquiescence and approach adopted by the university after 2 of their students, including a photographer for the esteemed Variety newspaper, conspired to assault a visiting speaker on campus and then gloat about it online. I hope to do a follow-up early in the new year now the dust has settled, but for now I'm really pleased this video reached one of my biggest audiences in 2019 because, well, the mainstream media mock, demonize or ignore them. It's really important that channels like this document the truth about men's rights activists and help to give the issues they campaign about a still much needed signal boost. And also, of course, document for prosperity the abuse and double standards that they so frequently have to put up with. Now, I should say that the 10 videos I've selected don't come in any particular order, but without a doubt, one of the videos I'm most proud of is the one I made to help promote William Collins's important book, The Empathy Gap. Okay, technically we turned it into 2, but it started out as 1, and while I think I managed to do a pretty effective job in a fairly short space of time, since it's mainly a quick-fire mishmash of other people's words, music and video, creatively speaking I'm not trying to claim it as my finest hour, but nevertheless it's little things like this that make this project all worthwhile. The Glass Blind Spot is propelled by a mishmash of personal motivations, and while some are more selfish or self-indulgent than others, one primary purpose is to provide me with the opportunity to do some activism and support causes that I believe in. When I was younger, I used to be involved in a lot of voluntary work projects, and while I'm not exactly over the hill just yet, creating something that I can deliver from my kitchen table feels like the right place for me to be right now. I'm totally in awe of people like Sargon, who took to the streets this year to campaign for free speech, and people like Natty and Elizabeth and Mike, who organise conferences and speaking events to champion men's rights, both issues that this channel focuses heavily on. And I do sometimes think about doing more on the ground activism myself, especially locally. Maybe I will at some point, and there are certain reasons why I currently don't, but that said, there's a lot that can be achieved from a kitchen table, and so while in the grand scheme of things my efforts may be a tiny drop in the ocean, it was an absolute honour to try and help promote what I believe is a truly important book, which deserves to find as wide an audience as possible, as does William himself, which is why I was delighted that he agreed to be one of my very first guests on my interview podcast. I'm not going to single out any one particular episode because I think all of the guests who took part over the year had interesting things to say, but I'm really pleased about how that series turned out, even if my interview skills still need a bit of work. Anyway, thank you to everyone who's listened to that series, because it's been a bit of a departure for me, and I'm looking forward to lining up some interesting guests early in the new year. Okay, so I guess it's time to talk about the biggest elephant in the room. By this stage, some of my friends who take a more casual interest in my channel think that I'm obsessed with the dishonourable member for Birmingham Yardley, and William Collins even reckons I secretly fancy her. And while admittedly I am starting to feel a little bit like her unofficial biographer, much like my focus on Carl Benjamin over the year, hopefully subscribers to the class Blind Spot get why it is that I keep putting a spotlight on her. Again, it's quite often as much about how the media portray her, but metaphorically speaking, she does somehow seem to keep managing to trip over and draw attention to issues that I want to talk about. So I guess what I want to say is that while she does manage to make herself out to be an incredibly unlikable person, I have no real personal animosity towards her, and it is getting to the stage where I kind of wish that she'd stop generating headlines so that I can stop making videos about them. I did actually tell William Collins recently that I was going to publicly pledge not to make another video about Jess Phillips unless something massive happened. And then almost immediately I stumbled upon the statement her former election opponent had made, accusing her of spreading false rape allegations, which predictably the legacy media have pretty much ignored. So, if you feel like helping to promote just one of my videos from 2019, then I would ask you that you help give Jess Phillips and those false allegations the signal boost I really feel it deserves. And while I do genuinely hope to move on to new subjects in 2020, I guess I'm not ready to make that public pledge just yet. Looking back to 2015 and the whole hoo-ha over her clash with Philip Davis, aside from the headlines and the hype it generated, the thing that initially drew my attention to Jess Phillips was the fact that up until a few months before she started making headlines, she had been working in an exclusively female-only environment. And I thought that the fact that she came from a job and a Labour candidate shortlist that quite literally wouldn't have a man about the place was extremely telling in the way that she spoke about men on that day. And it occurred to me at the time that, as well as offering some insight into the sort of attitudes that are tolerated or perhaps even promoted in female-only spaces, the fact that she had so recently been working as a business development manager for a domestic abuse charity that quite literally won't have a man about the place unless equality laws and funding criteria specifically require it, her childish and politically naive outburst on that day could very easily have been interpreted as being motivated by a very obvious conflict of interest. Because make no mistake about it, by now feminists have very much proved themselves to be entirely comfortable with throwing vulnerable boys and men under the bus time and time again when it comes to making their arguments for more state funding. I reckon things could have turned out very differently for her back then if the spin machine hadn't spun into action. And if Phillips had been a man, I suspect her career path would have taken a very different trajectory indeed. And while I'm sure that under similar circumstances most politicians would probably also have happily played the victim if it helped to save their bacon, one thing that particularly stood out about Jess Phillips was the fact that, in my humble subjective opinion, she was even prepared to throw her children under the bus, metaphorically speaking obviously, in an effort to save her own skin. Because whether or not she seriously believed for even 1 minute that someone was quite literally threatening the lives of the children of an MP they'd just watched laughing about suicide when they wrote to her to say that they hoped she came home to find them hanging, and given that the police don't appear to have interpreted as such, again in my humble subjective opinion, there was absolutely no need to shout about it so loudly and so often, so much so that the message will almost certainly have voiced back to her young children, and that they may very well have spent the last few years genuinely believing that somebody out there is literally out to get them. No wonder they asked you to quit after Jo Cox. Anyway, I once joked that it was entirely possible that Phillips could reach the apex of her career without ever having had to compete against a man. And while I very much doubt that her own campaign will end in success, at least this time, she has essentially talked the Labour Party into believing that their next leader must come from a pool of candidates that exclusively look a lot like her. And so the good news is that it strikes me that the up-and-coming Labour leadership contest provides a relatively unique opportunity to try and throw a bit of a spotlight directly onto the subject of male inequalities. And I just so happen to have a bit of a plan about how that might be done, which just so happens to involve every single subscriber who has taken the time to watch this far, and hopefully a whole lot more. All will be revealed early in the new year, but before then, don't forget to kick back with a few mostly more light-hearted videos on my new channel, which kicks off on New Year's night with a special storytelling edition of my occasional series about sexism, social justice, and science fiction. But before I go, let me leave you with one last thought about one last video. So, hopefully by now you're aware that I've been a lifelong champion of equality of opportunity for all, which is why I feel so strongly about many current mainstream attitudes towards the issue of male inequalities. And so I thought I'd finish with a few words about the Liberal Democrats' violent blind spot video, because I think it documents a positive message about the power of online activism. Liberal Democrat MP Layla Moran's tweet about her arrest for partner abuse would probably just have been the next day's fish paper had it not been for the quick action of activists like He Equal, who not only helped to bring it to the attention of a wider audience, but also highlighted the double standards and frankly bizarre reactions from some of her party colleagues. The complete lack of comment from senior party members was especially telling, and I thought Philip Davis MP did a brilliant job of drawing out those inconsistent narratives when it comes to gendered violence in his speech at ICMI in Chicago. Some people thought she should be forced to resign, much as a male Conservative MP had been for a lesser charge. But personally, I would have simply preferred if she had held her hands up, said she was sorry, and spoke out about stereotypes around domestic violence, such as this outrageous headline by Yasmin Albi Brown. Now, obviously, neither of those things happened. But she did very quickly pull out of putting her name in the hat for contention as party leader, and sources have cited her surprise at the public outcry as a specific reason for that. So my point is that the activism that some of you watching are involved in can really make a difference and help to put a spotlight on this sort of issues that can all too frequently be ignored. In many ways, it's been a strange old year, but I hope that everyone watching believes there are reasons to be positive as we enter the third decade of the 21st century. It may very well be a stunning and brave new world, and while sometimes it feels like it's completely out of control, I take comfort in the thought that the path we walk and the walk we choose is as important as the ultimate destination. Anyway, thanks again for all your support. All the best for 2020, and hopefully I'll be talking to some of you in a couple of days over on The Blind Side.
Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.
The Glass Blind Spot is brought to you by you, because it's your views, your likes and your comments that keep this show on the road.